In the wake of the abolition of slavery in the United States, a striking irony emerged. White slave owners received compensation for the emancipation of their enslaved individuals. This situation stemmed from a mindset that viewed black people as mere commodities, raising concerns among slave owners about their financial losses. To address this, President Abraham Lincoln introduced the Compensated Emancipation Act, which provided an average payout of $300 to each slave owner for the liberation of their slaves. However, this compensation failed to recognize the unimaginable horrors and brutality endured by the black community over 2.5 centuries of enslavement. Black slaves, who formed the backbone of the American economy and contributed significantly to infrastructure development, received no financial compensation for their labor. Instead, they survived on scant food rations, highlighting the stark injustice of their situation. As we delve into this topic, it becomes increasingly clear that the United States must address the historical wrongs by making reparations to the descendants of Black Americans who suffered profound injustices. This crucial issue has been long overlooked, shrouded in complexity, and often dismissed as unfounded. However, this cannot continue any longer. In this video, we will explore the pressing need for reparations for the descendants of Black Americans who endured the atrocities of slavery. Various reports and surveys have been conducted to determine an appropriate amount that should be paid to each individual. And we will share these findings with you. Let's embark on this journey together. Slavery in the United States was not just an economic institution. It was a dehumanizing practice that treated Africans and African Americans as tradable assets. Over 600,000 enslaved individuals were forcibly brought to the U.S., representing 5% of the staggering 12 million Africans captured during the transatlantic slave trade that began in 1526. Join us as we uncover this critical chapter of American history and discuss the implications for justice today. During the early colonial era, Britain's burgeoning colonies, which would eventually become the 13 United States, actively engaged in the practice of slavery. This dark chapter in American history saw countless Africans forcibly taken from their homeland, enduring unimaginable hardships as they were subjected to grueling labor on American soil. Their toil was crucial in cultivating lucrative crops such as tobacco and cotton, which became the backbone of the colonial economy. As time progressed, millions of black individuals were legally classified as property, stripped of their humanity and subjected to brutal treatment and exploitation. This system of slavery transformed them into a significant source of unpaid labor, fueling the economic engine that would propel the United States to global prominence. By 1860, the collective value of enslaved individuals reached an astounding $3.5 billion, a figure that would be equivalent to approximately $115 billion today. This staggering valuation underscored the grim reality that enslaved people were not just laborers. They were regarded as the most valuable assets in the entire U.S. economy. In the antebellum South, black slaves comprised around 13% of the Southern population. Many lived on expansive plantations or smaller farms, with some slaveholders owning as many as 50 enslaved individuals. These numbers reflect a deeply entrenched system where the lives and labor of Black Americans were intertwined with the economic prosperity of the nation, raising profound questions about morality, justice, and the long-lasting impact of slavery on American society. As the 18th century drew to a close, the once thriving tobacco farms of the southern United States faced economic ruin due to the exhaustion of the land. This environmental crisis coincided with the nation's westward expansion and the rise of the abolitionist movement, casting a shadow of uncertainty over the future of slavery in America. The growing unrest around this issue ignited a contentious national dialogue that ultimately set the stage for the monumental upheaval of the Civil War. Despite the significant wealth generated by their forced labor, Black Americans found themselves deprived of any benefits from their contributions. Interestingly, during this tumultuous time, the U.S. government recognized the need for reparations and issued an order under Field Order 15, which aimed to allocate 40 acres of land and a mule to each formerly enslaved family. This initiative represented a glimmer of hope, providing an opportunity for Black Americans to build wealth and achieve financial stability. However, following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, a dramatic shift occurred. President Andrew Johnson adopted a contrasting approach, revoking Field Order 15 and opting to return the land to former slave owners rather than ensuring that black individuals had the resources needed to support themselves. This decision starkly illuminated the systemic injustices ingrained in the fabric of the United States, underscoring the pervasive racism and the lingering legacy of slavery. The federal government effectively reinforced the power of those who had once enslaved black Americans, compensating slave owners in Washington, D.C., and surrounding areas for the loss of what they considered property, namely, the freed individuals. This practice of compensating former slave owners was widespread across various states, revealing a troubling reality. Not only did these slave owners profit immensely from the exploitation of black Americans, but they also continued to derive additional income from the labor of the formerly enslaved, who had no choice but to work the land they had once toiled on under duress. This cycle of injustice perpetuated the economic disparities that would resonate for generations, leaving a lasting impact on American society and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. Despite gaining their freedom, black Americans found themselves without any form of wealth or sustainable means of livelihood, marking the troubling genesis of a persistent wealth gap that endures to this day. In the wake of the American Civil War, state governments in the former Confederate states implemented a series of oppressive measures aimed at curtailing the voting rights of black citizens and enforcing racial segregation. To achieve these insidious goals, they enacted black codes and Jim Crow laws throughout the southern United States. These laws were designed to systematically undermine the rights and freedoms of African Americans. From that point forward, until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination and segregation were not only legally sanctioned but actively enforced at every level of society. African Americans faced pervasive social, economic, and legal discrimination, encountering segregated facilities in theaters, hotels, and restaurants, and often experiencing outright denial of service. This environment fostered a climate of fear and inequality, where the promise of freedom was overshadowed by oppressive laws and societal norms. Interestingly, prior to the 20th century, many African Americans had managed to establish a foothold in the economy by owning homes, farmland, and urban properties. These achievements, however, were consistently threatened by discriminatory practices and violent reprisals from those who sought to maintain the status quo. The struggle for economic stability and social equality continued, as African Americans fought against the barriers that sought to erase their progress and deny them the rights and opportunities that were their birthright. Notably, Tulsa was home to a thriving Black Wall Street, a vibrant and predominantly prosperous black community that exemplified economic success and resilience. However, as the wealth of black residents grew, so too did the prejudice, hostility, and envy harbored by certain white individuals. This escalating tension prompted both governmental forces and white supremacists to take significant measures aimed at undermining the prosperity of the black community. As black individuals achieved greater financial success and property ownership, some envious white citizens resorted to violence and brutal acts in an effort to uphold the tenets of white supremacy. The horrific reality of this era is underscored by the work of organizations like the Tuskegee Institute and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which meticulously documented over 3,000 lynchings that occurred between 1865 and 1965. These acts of terror served not only as a means of social control but also as a stark reminder of the lengths to which individuals would go to maintain racial hierarchies. As we reflect on this painful chapter of American history, we invite you to support our efforts in shedding light on these important issues. By subscribing to our channel and liking this video, you can help us continue creating content that educates and informs. We are dedicated to building a strong community around these vital conversations, and your support is crucial in this endeavor. Now, let's continue our exploration of the historical events that shaped the struggle for equality and justice. Many of the victims of racial violence were landowners, and the overarching objective was to eliminate black wealth, seize black-owned land, and perpetuate the ideals of white supremacy. Disturbingly, some white officials not only turned a blind eye but actively endorsed and supported this violence. legitimizing acts of terror against the black community. Initially, these lynchings primarily targeted individual families. But the brutality escalated to the point where entire black communities were devastated. Two notable instances highlight this tragic reality: the forced removal of families in Fawcett County, Georgia, in 1912, and the catastrophic destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921. In these instances, black landowners faced immense pressure from both authorities and fellow citizens, forcing them to abandon their land and livelihoods. This systemic violence transformed them into refugees in their own country, stripped of their homes and hard-earned wealth. The profound impact of these events continues to resonate today, as the significant wealth gap between African Americans and white individuals can largely be traced back to the federal housing policies implemented throughout the 20th century. These policies, which often excluded black citizens and marginalized communities from fair housing opportunities, entrenched economic disparities that persist in contemporary society. As we examine these historical injustices, it becomes essential to recognize their lasting effects and advocate for change that addresses the inequities rooted in our past. While African American incomes average roughly 60% of their white counterparts, the disparity in wealth is even more stark. African American wealth constitutes only 5% of white wealth. In the United States, the financial stability of most middle-class families is largely derived from the equity they hold in their homes. This fundamental gap between the 60% income ratio and the mere 5% wealth ratio can be largely attributed to discriminatory federal housing policies that have persisted for decades. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 60s, African American families were systematically prohibited from purchasing homes in suburban areas due to racially discriminatory practices, including redlining and restrictive covenants. These policies not only barred them from accessing the same housing opportunities as white families but also denied them the chance to benefit from the significant equity appreciation that many white families enjoyed over the years. When the Fair Housing Act was finally enacted in 1968, it was intended to open the doors to homeownership for African Americans in suburban neighborhoods. However, by this time, the housing market had already become financially unattractive and often unattainable for many black families. The homes that were now available were frequently priced out of reach, and the long-term effects of years of exclusion had already compounded the wealth gap. This historical context underscores the urgent need for continued efforts toward equity in housing and economic opportunity, as the legacy of these discriminatory practices continues to shape the financial landscape for African American families today. Meanwhile, white families continue to acquire homes, reaping the benefits of equity and the subsequent accumulation of wealth. This advantage allows them to use their home equity to finance their children's college education and support their elderly parents, fostering financial independence without relying heavily on their descendants. In stark contrast, many black families remain locked out of these opportunities due to the systemic barriers that have historically prevented them from building wealth. This disparity brings the concept of reparations into the conversation. Reparations, aimed at addressing the historical injustices endured by black Americans, are not a new idea. They have been the subject of ongoing debate, advocacy, and legislative proposals for many years, reflecting a growing recognition of the need to rectify the long-standing effects of slavery and discrimination. One prominent example of this ongoing effort is the H.R. 40 bill, which has been introduced in various sessions of Congress since 1989, officially titled the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. This bill seeks to establish a commission that would explore the impact of slavery and racial discrimination, assess the need for reparations, and propose appropriate measures to address these historical injustices. As discussions around reparations gain momentum, it is crucial to recognize their potential role in creating a more equitable society, one that acknowledges and seeks to rectify the wrongs of the past while paving the way for a more just future. The primary objective of the H.R. 40 bill is to establish a commission tasked with examining the enduring impacts of slavery and discrimination, ultimately formulating potential solutions in the form of reparations. Despite its multiple introductions over the years, the H.R. 40 bill has yet to advance into law, reflecting the complexities and challenges surrounding the topic of reparations, which continues to spark considerable debate. Critics argue that reparations may not effectively address the multifaceted challenges posed by historical injustices. They suggest that alternative approaches, such as targeted investments in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, could yield a more profound and immediate impact on the lives of Black Americans. Some express concerns that implementing reparations could further polarize the nation, raising difficult questions about eligibility. Should all Black Americans receive compensation? Or only the descendants of those who can trace their lineage back to slavery? Additionally, opponents question the morality of taxpayers funding reparations, arguing that no one alive today bears direct responsibility for historical injustices like slavery. In contrast, economist William Darity, co-author of the book From Here to Equality, presents a compelling argument for targeted reparations as a means to close the racial wealth gap. He believes this approach represents the most effective strategy for addressing both historical and current wealth disparities within America. According to Darity's calculations, achieving this objective would require an expenditure of approximately $350,000 per eligible recipient. Under Darity's proposal, direct payments would be disbursed to an estimated 47 million Americans who identify as Black. To qualify for these reparations, individuals would need to have identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before the reparations plan takes effect. Furthermore, they would be required to provide evidence of at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, with census records serving as one method for establishing this ancestry. As the conversation around reparations continues to evolve, it remains essential to consider the various perspectives and proposed solutions, ultimately striving for a more equitable society that addresses the historical injustices of the past. However, despite the growing discourse around reparations, practical steps have yet to be taken by the U.S. government and state authorities. The Black American community is inherently entitled to reparations as citizens of the United States, making it their rightful claim to receive compensation for the injustices endured throughout history. While various detailed proposals have been presented, multiple administrations have only skimmed the surface of this critical issue without implementing any concrete actions. A study published in the Review of Black Political Economy underscores the magnitude of this moral obligation, suggesting that when considering all factors related to slavery, the U.S. owes approximately $151 million to every Black American. This staggering figure highlights the complexities and challenges surrounding reparations, as it also illustrates why the U.S. has historically avoided confronting this topic head-on. Even if the full amount of $151 million cannot be disbursed, many advocates argue that at least $350,000 should be allocated to each eligible Black American. This raises a crucial question: who will bear the financial responsibility for these reparations? Initially, there was a strong suggestion that the federal government should shoulder the responsibility for funding reparations. This proposal reflects a recognition that the government has a duty to rectify the historical wrongs and systemic injustices that have persisted for generations. As discussions about reparations continue, it is vital to engage with the moral, economic, and social implications of this issue, pushing for meaningful action that acknowledges the historical injustices faced by the Black community and works toward a more equitable future. The argument here is that the federal government bears a significant responsibility for the institution of slavery, as it was rooted in federal law and protected by the Constitution. Therefore, establishing a dedicated fund for reparations is seen as a necessary step. Some proposals advocate for corporations that have historical ties to slavery or have profited from it to contribute to the reparations fund. This may contain corporations rooted in industries like banking, insurance, or cotton production, which had direct connections to slavery. Among these proposals, the argument that those who inherited the wealth and land amassed by slave owners should compensate the descendants of former slaves appears more practical. Those who have inherited wealth and land acquired through the exploitation of enslaved people bear a moral and legal responsibility to address this historical injustice. If we argue that the descendants of former slaves should not receive reparations because they did not personally endure the brutalities of slavery, then it follows that the descendants of white supremacist slave owners should also not retain the wealth generated from that institution. In such a scenario, this wealth should be renounced and returned, as it was built upon the exploitation and suffering of countless individuals. Legally and ethically, this wealth rightfully belongs to the descendants of those enslaved, who continue to face structural and systemic racism that perpetuates inequality. Isn't it evident that providing reparations to Black Americans is not just a legal obligation but also a profound moral responsibility? The legacy of slavery has created enduring disparities that affect generations, and addressing these injustices is crucial for fostering true equality in our society. As we ponder this significant issue, we must ask, will America ultimately pay reparations? Or will it sidestep this responsibility as it has with other matters related to Black Americans? We invite you to share your thoughts on whether you support reparations and what steps you believe should be taken moving forward. If you'd like to see more videos addressing these critical topics and exploring Black history, please support us by subscribing and clicking the bell icon for updates. You can also check out more insightful content on our channel, as we continue to delve into the rich tapestry of Black history and its relevance today.